Hello, internet friends. I missed making a nice 2025 wrap up in a timely manner because the end of my 2025 was really crazy, so I'm making this very belated one instead because I did have a lot of memorable books last year that I read that I really want to talk about. I thought I would do separate best of and worst of videos, but who has time for that? I don't have time, so I'm just gonna do it all in this one video. Best books of last year, worst books of last year, to lighten the negativity a little bit. I'm gonna also do like books that I recommend instead of those worst books that are kind of like similar vibes, but in a good way. So let's start with the worst books. Let's start with a little controversy, and this one may annoy people. I had the misfortune of reading The Summer I Turned Pretty by Jenny Han, and I really hated it. And I want to say I'm not just a hater. I watched the first season of the TV show and I did enjoy it, so I was like, oh, I guess I should read the book, and I just thought the book was so much worse than the TV show. If you have somehow missed The Summer I Turned Pretty hype and don't know what it's about, so it's about this teenager, Isabel Belly. She goes to a summer house every summer with her family, and the house is owned by like these family friends who are much wealthier than they are, so they own this beautiful house out near the beach, and the two families, specifically the moms and their kids, go to the beach house every summer and they hang out and have a great time. This other family that they hang out with has two sons, Jeremiah and Conrad. Belly was always kind of friends with them when she was growing up, but then this book is about the one summer where suddenly she's kind of come into herself as a teenager. She's feeling much prettier and more confident, and suddenly the boys start to take notice of her as a love interest. My cat would like to participate in this video. She really wants some attention right now. So for some reason, when I was watching the TV show, this didn't really occur to me, but then as I was reading the book, it suddenly struck me like, why is this even a romantic concept to begin with? This idea that she's gonna be involved with these two different brothers, and throughout the book series, I guess, I haven't read the other ones, but she becomes involved with them at different times. They're kind of competing for her, and sometimes at different times, you know, she's into one versus the other one more, which I find really strange as like a romantic concept, because to me it's like, that doesn't sound romantic at all. That actually sounds really stressful, and it's probably just gonna sow a lot of division and resentment in this family. This seems like a really bad situation, especially because there are multiple ups and downs and breakups and get-togethers involved. I just don't see how this can lead anywhere good. That does not feel romantic to me. I was also super creeped out when the boy's mother, at one point, who it's eventually revealed is dying of cancer, so she actually says to Belly, oh, I know you're gonna end up with one of my boys someday, which seems like such a creepy and bizarre thing to say to a 16-year-old, especially if you know you're dying. Now you're gonna leave this kid with guilt over having to choose one of the sons to like live up to your wishes or something, and also like, why do you want your boys to be fighting over this girl? It was just very strange, and I honestly didn't enjoy the book at all. But if you're a Jenny Han fan and this upsets you, hold your rage, because I would very much like to recommend another series by Jenny Han that I read this year, the Burn for Burn series. I thought I would film this all in one take, but I didn't have time, so I'm back here on another day to add that there was a Jenny Han series I absolutely loved that I read last year, and it was the Burn for Burn series. This series was co-authored with Siobhan Vivian, and it's a trilogy. I enjoyed this one so much because it starts out feeling like it's going to be a standard beachy romance read, and then it turns into something else entirely, and it gets very dark indeed. This series follows three girls at a high school on an island off the coast of New England, Mary, Kat, and Lilia, and they are completely different. Lilia is a rich and beautiful cheerleader who runs with the in crowd. Kat is this emo goth girl who's working class and doesn't have as much money as most other families on the island, so she really has to struggle. And then Mary is just kind of this outcast who's very shy, very uncertain of herself, doesn't really have a place with anyone in the high school. The three girls run into the bathroom just by chance one day and start talking and realize that they all have people that they want to get revenge on. They hatch a plan to extract revenge on their various enemies, and their whole concept behind this is that no one will ever suspect they've been scheming together because they never talk. They're not in the same cliques at all. So they plot some pranks. It's a very satisfying prank story for a while until one of their pranks goes horribly wrong. This series was suspenseful. It was interesting. The characters, even though they seem to be like these character stereotypes at first, the characters are really not stereotypical at all, and they evolve in surprising ways throughout the series. The series does also deal with some heavy issues such as assault, so be aware of that if you do decide to read it. The next book that I found deeply frustrating in 2025 and was one of my least favorite books that I read was Heart the Lover by Lily King, and in order to explain why I hated this book so much, it does require require spoilers, so skip this section if you don't want spoilers on this one. And this was a bit of an unexpected one for me because I've read Euphoria by Lily King and I thought it was excellent, and also it was kind of weird because she's a very good writer. She's very skilled. She's excellent at dialogue. She's excellent at developing characters and building these small moments that create a really vivid fictional world. The book is basically about the love story of this woman in college who is an English major, and she falls in with these two other quirky, charming English majors. She has a relationship with one who's this very conservative Catholic, and that creates a lot of conflict in their relationship because she is not conservative at all. She ends up breaking up with him, and then against his wishes, she ends up getting with his best friend. She and the best friend have this seemingly wonderful relationship. I enjoyed most of the book up until that point. Then after graduation, she and her boyfriend are meant to meet up in the same city to have jobs there, and he just totally ghosts her. And this is about halfway through the book that we find out that he ghosted her. She meets another man, gets married, has kids with him, and seems to be pretty happy with her life. The part that was really infuriating to me about this book is the guy, her former college boyfriend, turns out to be dying from cancer at a young age, and he has really alienated people in his life because it turns out that he's kind of done this to people throughout his life, where when things get too emotionally intense, he ghosts them because he's not able to cope with the fear of emotional intimacy. So he basically has no one. He's dying from cancer. He's like in his 40s or 50s, and he calls on her to ditch everything in her life to basically be with him while he's dying. And her son is also dying from cancer, like at the same time. And she has to miss, I mean, she doesn't have to, but she chooses to miss some of her son's very critical cancer appointments to go be with this guy as he's dying. And I understand that she wants to give him comfort and whatever, but the book kind of presents this as this like really romantic thing. And it actually really bothered me because it was like, great, this man is so selfish and awful and like unable to commit that he ditched you when you were really in love when you were young, and now that he needs someone, now that he needs something from you, he's gonna suddenly resurface and do something incredibly selfish in your life again, and you participate in that, and the book is presenting this as though it's like this really romantic thing. Ew, no thank you. I really disliked that. It was very frustrating to read about. And the other thing too was I think this novel really suffered from sort of literary writer syndrome, where the author is very skilled. She's an excellent writer, but it's almost like she's a little too pleased with herself on that. And almost the entire last half of the book is taken up with this guy slowly dying and these speculations and conversations that they have about the meaning of life that are really not that interesting, which was weird and disappointing because the conversations that they had in the first half of the book when they're in college are fun to read about and they're interesting and unique. But the stuff that they're talking about like the meaning of life and philosophy and stuff at the end is really boring and sophomoric. I did not find it compelling at all. The book feels as though it wants us to be impressed by this, which really bothered me. It also wanted us to be impressed with these characters who, just because they're clever and literary, we're supposed to care about them, which I think is a flaw that a lot of literary authors fall into. See also my rant back on my other YouTube channel when I was still posting books there about writers writing about writers writing, which often doesn't end well. Also, I always find it a little annoying when writers write books about writers who just succeed in their careers like magically, like everything falls into place for them and they become famous and it's all wonderful. And this is definitely colored with bias for me because, you know, I dreamed of being a writer as a young person and it didn't really, I mean, obviously I guess there's still time, but it didn't really work out the way that I hoped it would. And I did not find instant success. It's really irritating to read these sort of dreamlike fantasies of writers for whom everything just falls into place, especially because a lot of them take place back in the day when it was possible to actually kind of have a career as a writer and like actually get paid so you could actually focus on it, which is really not something that exists except for very, very few people now. I mean, I know it was always sort of unlikely that you would succeed in that, but it does feel like back in the day, like you could actually get paid for writing short stories and you may actually get paid to be a literary author before so many aspects of different different careers in publishing and writing completely collapsed. So that always just kind of annoys me a little. It's like, I don't want to read about this. Like, this is not fun for me to read about. I don't like it. So a frustrating case of a book that was technically very well written and actually really engaged me at first. Otherwise, I would have just not finished it. I have no qualms about dumping a book if I don't like it. It was so annoying because I did like it at first, and then halfway through the book, it kind of took this turn into a thing that I really didn't enjoy. And so that was sort of a surprise worst book of 2025. If you want to read something with similar vibes to that book, but one that is actually enjoyable, or one that I would recommend, I recommend Old School by Tobias Wolff, which is about a boy in a preparatory high school who really wants to be a writer, and he's entering these writing competitions, and they don't actually go how he anticipates, which I really like because I feel like it's much more true to the experience of attempting to become a writer, where there are these failures and there's people that you're jealous of, and you may or may not achieve the level of success that you desire. And then there's also this plagiarism drama, so that's a really good one. It's really well written, and I feel like it also has more self-awareness because in the end he realizes that perhaps his struggles aren't as important as he thought they were. So that one is one that I really enjoyed and would recommend if you're looking for something similar about like young aspiring writers in their school days. The next one on the list is kind of a sad one for me because it's actually by one of my favorite authors, but man, this book was so bad, and it is Good News by Edward Abbey. Edward Abbey is an interesting character. He is so hit or miss. He has some books that are amazing, and like this one, some books that are really bad. I was curious to read this one because I mean, I'm trying to make my way through all of his work because I admire him so much, and some of his writing is my absolute favorite, but I was also intrigued because it's this dystopian novel. He very much thought that civilization was going to collapse soon because we are not consuming sustainably. We're so far outstripping the planet's resources. He thought it was going to happen probably like soon after his own lifetime, which I kind of agree with him on that. I mean, it hasn't quite happened yet, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happened sometime this century. He was looking at consumerism and the just absolutely rampant, unnecessary over-consumerism and saying like, we really don't need this. This is going to cause society to collapse at some point because we are far beyond what resources the earth can actually provide. So this novel is a dystopian, like after civilization mostly collapses kind of novel, which was really unusual for him because mostly he wrote realistic fiction. So I was very curious to see his foray into speculative fiction, and unfortunately that was not his strength. I don't know how this even got published. I mean, it was toward the end of his career. This was one of the last things he wrote, so I assume it was because at that point he was already pretty well known and people were going to buy what he wrote. So probably the publisher was like, yeah, let's publish this. I would be surprised if anyone actually was like, yes, this is a good book. I thought it was absolutely horrendous. It was interesting because there were parts where he talks about like techno-fascism, which I think actually were disturbingly relevant to things that are going on currently. And so he had like, there's sort of like nomads hanging out in the outskirts who are like riding around on horseback. And then there's like the collapsed remnants of cities where this fascist leader is trying to lead a gang of people with motorcycles to take over the rest of like the remnants of the United States. Cause like things have just entirely collapsed and there's just like city states at this point, which does sound kind of interesting, but it didn't really cohere into a vision that I felt was very convincing. So for instance, I think Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood is one of the most disturbing dystopias I've ever read because it's just so believable. Her vision of what our world is becoming and how it could become that is so complete and so based on very specific technologies that are emerging. This book felt more just kind of like discombobulated rantings of various things that he was upset about. Also, it was deeply sexist, which like, yes, he's a bit sexist in a lot of his writing, but in some of his books there actually is real sympathy for female characters and real moments where it's clear to me that he saw those characters as fully human. And in this book, the women are just sex objects. It's like, oh, dude, like, what are you doing? This is so embarrassing. And I'm jumping in here while editing to add that he unfortunately also has some really cringy racial stereotypes throughout the book. It's really, really bad. I find it to be shameful that his publisher even permitted this to be published because it's just such a bad look for him. If you are a fan of Edward Abbey and or people that are very critical of the system of industry that we have and interested in environmental writing, a similar book also by Edward Abbey that I really love is Fire on the Mountain, which is his third novel, and I reread that one in 2025. I had read it previously. That one is excellent. So it's really interesting to see somebody like your favorite authors just be all over the place in terms of like, this book is quite good and this one is total garbage. Fire on the Mountain is about a boy who I think is 12 years old, and in the summers when he has the break from school, he goes out from the East Coast where he lives to stay with his grandfather who lives out west. The grandfather owns a ranch. This summer that he's out there with his grandfather, the government decides that they really want the grandfather to give up his land in order to put a military base there. At first, they kind of like give him offers of, oh, we'll buy it from you and we'll give you this good deal, but he just absolutely refuses. Things really go south. There's a full-on rebellion against the government. There's a lot of interesting writing about the environment in this one. For instance, he talks about how when the government agents come onto the grandfather's land, they talk about how useless certain aspects of the ecosystem are. They say this plant is useless because it's not being directly used to feed the cattle and you need to cut them out and you're not using your land properly. So he does have those elements of looking at how the government, a capitalist government, views land in terms of looking at land and the ecosystem for its economic value and nothing else. And it's this sort of like some of his other books, like The Monkey Wrench Gang is almost like a revenge fantasy for environmentalists, and this one is kind of like a really satisfying story of just like absolutely rebelling against that system. Another really bad book I read in 2025 was Bad Summer People by Emma Rosenblum. Emma Rosenblum writes these dishy novels that seem like they should be fun to read. I actually read all 3 of her books that I was able to get as audiobooks. All of them enticed me because they sounded like they were going to be these fun, gossipy, lighthearted summer reads of drama of like rich people and tech people stabbing each other in the back. It's fun to read something like that sometimes. Like, I did not expect this to be a serious novel. It was meant to be something entertaining and light to read in the middle of stressful world events. This particular one centers around 2 married couples who both secretly hate their spouses. I mean, or maybe not so secretly at times. They're cheating on each other. They're doing all kinds of stuff. There's like this affair with a tennis coach, and the tennis coach is committing fraud. The thing that was odd about this book to me is it felt like it should have been fun to read, especially because apparently she bases these on actual stories of people that like summer in the Hamptons, but it was just so mean-spirited and dull and ultimately uninteresting. She had no sympathy for any of her characters. All of her characters are terrible people. You're not interested in any of them, and none of them are interesting. They're all super shallow. It's not fun to read about them. Ultimately, because I don't care about these characters, I don't really find myself caring whether they're cheating on each other and who's getting with the hot tennis coach or whatever. Like, it was actually really not fun to read, and it was hard to get through. If you do want to read a book that's sort of dishy about rich people and the things they do in their parties and whatever, the one I would recommend is Under the Influence by Joyce Maynard, which is about a single mom who gets pulled into this rich couple's orbit. That one was much more fun to me to read, even though it ends up being sad in the end, because she writes really well about the things that are cool about these rich people's lives, like their beautiful house and their art collection and the stuff they get to do, whereas I didn't really feel like there wasn't even an element of fun voyeurism in Rosenblum's novel. But Maynard is also much more in tune, I think, with her characters. Her characters act in ways that, even if they're not great, you understand why they're doing it, and you have a lot of sympathy for them as the reader because there's much more of a look into their interior lives. And I talked about that and other books with this kind of general vibe in my White Lotus video. The final worst book of my 2025 reading year was If You Love It, Let It Kill You by Hannah Pittard. This was another example of a literary writer who is competent as a writer, who is just entirely too pleased with herself and thinks that because she's a clever writer, that should automatically make you interested in her, and she's not actually that interesting. It seems that the only reason that I and maybe people in general know about her at all is because a couple years ago there was an article about her and her writer friends. There were 2 married couples. She was in one couple and then her friends were the other couple. There was cheating that happened within the friend group. Her husband cheated on her with her best friend, which is terrible. I'm sorry that that happened to Hannah. But this happened years ago, and in the intervening time since then, she and her husband have written not one, but several books inspired by this incident and about each other, and it seems that they have nothing going on in their lives besides being writers and writing about this cheating incident. It is so boring. I believe believe the husband wrote a novel about her. She wrote a memoir about the husband. And now this book, this If You Love It, Let It Kill You, which is a ridiculous, annoying title, by the way, this is her autofiction account of things happening after that. And similar to the book that I spoke about last time, Macy Neely's book, it was kind of annoying where I went into this thinking that it was going to be juicier than it was, and she really doesn't give you anything. So it's annoying because it's like, okay, the one thing that is slightly interesting about you is there was this real life cheating scandal, and now you and your husband or your ex-husband are trying to get revenge on each other by writing these like petty books based on each other, and yet it didn't even talk about him that much. So it really wasn't even that interesting, and it's sort of this conglomeration of quirky anecdotes about her family members who it feels like she wants you to think they're interesting because they're a little weird, but it feels like it's almost too cute. It's kind of like Wes Anderson vibes where it's like trying so hard to be quirky and unique, and it feels like too much where it's like, I'm not intrigued by these unusual characters. I'm just annoyed at how contrived they seem and how ridiculous and weird this family is. Also, I don't know if Hannah herself is like this because this is a work of fiction, but the character in the novel is like a terrible person. Like, she's a compulsive liar. She's very bizarre in ways that are not compelling. Like, she plays this game called Dead Body with her husband where she lies down on the bed and pretends to be a dead body and he has to like move her around, which was like, I find this weird in not a good way and kind of alarming. She's just like, she just kind of seems like a nasty person, like not her, the character that's portrayed in this book, but at the same time, like the book is marketed as a work of autofiction. So I don't know how much of this actually is her. Either way, the person that was narrating this, I was just like, ugh, I don't like this person. I would definitely stay away from them in real life. She has this bizarre conceit that she introduces of a talking cat, which is meant to be like quirky and meta and funny, and like it's suggested by the students in her creative writing class. She has these little interludes where she's teaching creative writing. It's just too much. It didn't come together for me. It was very annoying. If you want to read a book about writer drama that is not too far stuck up its own and is actually entertaining and like makes fun of the writers in a way that's really self-aware, I would recommend The Plot by Jean Hanff Korelitz, which I talked about more in detail in a separate older video. Okay, now on to the best books I read in 2025. In fiction, I finally read The Poisonwood Bible by Barbara Kingsolver, which I feel like I'd heard about this book for such a long time and I never read it. Finally got around to reading it. I was very impressed. This was such a deeply researched and interesting and relevant book. It's about an evangelical pastor who takes his family and relocates them to the country that was at the time Belgian Congo in the 1950s. And it's about the family's trials of learning about the culture there, these cultural clashes that happen because he's basically trying to convert the people that live in this small village, and there's a lot of cultural misunderstandings. One thing that was really interesting about the book is it really showed how his arrogance in coming in and being like, oh, I'm gonna convert these people to the true way, is very much undermined by the villagers really strongly sticking with their own culture. And actually it was kind of satisfying to read about them just being like, who is this guy? Like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This is the way we do things. They're very resistant to him, and he's undermined in ways that are kind of funny in a really dark way. His mission ends up being a total failure. Meanwhile, his 4 daughters all deal with this experience of moving to a very different culture and place in entirely different ways, and the book switches between their various points of view. It was really interesting how she was able to inhabit how each of these girls reacts completely differently. There was also a lot in the book that was really disturbing about US imperialism and how the United States government interfered with events that were happening in the Congo around the time. Things that I didn't know about that you don't learn about in your US history class. And of course, the events of last year deeply undermined many beliefs that I had as an American about our country and what we stand for. And I'm still wrestling personally with how much of it was lies and propaganda all along. It's become clear that like there have been these very dark impulses in American history all throughout time, and there have been times where it's been suppressed more than others. Unfortunately, this is a time where those forces have really broken out and taken over and are just absolutely destroying the country. And like, I'm just so sorry like to the world that America's horrible right now. But it was interesting in this book, which was published much earlier than current events, to read about how this has actually been going on for a long time. There's things that you definitely as an American child growing up in history class don't learn about that your country did that are very bad. And this sort of this imperialist strain, this determination to enforce capitalism that benefits rich people and to undermine other countries that may be experimenting with something different. This sort of imperialist capitalism that seeks to exploit another country's resources and people. It was really upsetting to read about that in the book, but at the same time, it was also deeply illuminating, and I really appreciated that Barbara Kingsolver wrote about this and took the time to research this book, because apparently it was a very difficult book for her to write, which I can imagine, because I mean, it was so detailed. It must have involved so many years of research, and not only the historical research, but then also developing these really complex characters and following the characters as they interact with all these different world events. Also, the other thing that really resonated with me is the sisters in the book have completely opposite reactions to the same events and like the same inputs from their environment, which I found very relevant, because I've found that, you know, with my own family members, it's really interesting how you can grow up in the same family, the same environment, and have completely opposite reactions to the same information and environment. One of the sisters kind of like becomes this very progressive person who rebels against her society by marrying a man from Africa, and she talks about like the racism that he experiences. That there's a scene where they go back to the United States and she's just really horrified that people in the United States are like treating this man with such a lack of respect, when like he's this person that she just couldn't help falling in love with, because she immediately was like impressed by how intelligent and honorable he was, and that was like such a heartbreaking scene. There's also a scene where when they're living in the United States, they go into a grocery store and she's just like absolutely disgusted by how unnecessary so many of the products are in the grocery store, and like the overwhelming consumerism that's so unnecessary and that's causing all this devastation around the world, because the United States is exploiting all these global supply chains and resources from other countries, labor from other countries, that she just feels disgusted, and she just has to leave the grocery store, because it's like, wow, you know, people are starving, and then in America there's like this store that is just filled with products that you don't even need. It was kind of not nice, but it was sort of a relief to see somebody in a book feeling the same way that it can sometimes feel to be living in this society that's like so excessive and has such a ridiculous level of consumption that like really damages the world. Meanwhile, there's this other sister who just kind of adopts unthinkingly the racism that she's raised with, and just like continues in that vein and marries a succession of people as she kind of continues in her journey of social climbing in like white society in Africa. And she thinks her sister is so weird, you know, so the sisters are very at odds with each other. I appreciated that Kingsolver was able to write about the conflicts that can happen even between family members when they react in these very different ways to the world around them. Fascinating book. It was amazing. I came away with such respect for her skill as an author, and I highly recommend this book. The next one was Fire on the Mountain by Edward Abbey. I really love this book, and I talked about it a bit in the last section, so I'm not going to go over it again. There was also another reread on the list that was one of my top books for 2025, and I did mention that briefly also in the previous section. It is Oryx and Crake by Margaret Atwood, and this is one of my favorite in that it's very realistic. One of the most upsetting dystopias I've ever read, up there with Feed by M.T. Anderson, which is another one that is just like really disturbingly true and tough to read, because it's just so, it just seems so plausible, and we're just like, I mean, we're basically barreling there on a high-speed train right now, except we don't have high-speed trains because we don't believe in public transit. So Oryx and Crake it's like told in these sort of two storylines, and it follows this main character, Jimmy. So we see Jimmy's childhood, follow him through the years, but then we get these interludes where he's an adult and civilization has totally collapsed. This is like a good version of, I think, what Edward Abbey was trying to do in Good News, where like Margaret Atwood is much more successful. It's much more of a coherent vision of like why this society collapsed, the specific personalities of the characters that contribute to that. So she basically envisions this world where we're getting there. We're not far away from this at this point, but basically the government, and I think it's sort of implied in the novel that this is the United States, because I'm so sorry, Canada. Unfortunately, we're your neighbor. And so she writes about this crazy shit happening in the United States a lot. So basically, the United States government still exists, but it's pretty much been superseded by a bunch of really powerful tech corporations that essentially run everything and have replaced the functions of the government with their own private staffing. Voting exists, but it's not really relevant anymore. It's very much controlled by the corporations and like the techno-fascist government, which, hello 2026. There's a lot of inequality in this world. People who have the skills to get a job at the fancy tech corporations live in what are essentially company towns, which are very safe and nice and manicured, but their lives are also very controlled. They're surveilled heavily. And then on the outside, which they call the pleblands, which I think is kind of a really funny, dark way to describe, it's just like total chaos out there. Like the people in the pleblands are starving. They're working in these horrible exploitative jobs. They have very little money and resources. They don't have access to good schools. Jimmy grows up in sort of a privileged environment because his dad works at one of the fancy companies, and as he moves up, he goes to like even better companies. He becomes friends with this boy who his name is Glenn, but he later on becomes referred to as Craig. Craig eventually grows up to become one of the top evil tech bros in his society, and he has a vision for humanity that is interesting and that he seeks to inflict upon the world. So, I mean, she published this book, I think in 2003, and it's very upsetting to me, like, as the years have passed and I continue to reread this book, like, how much closer and closer we get to her, what she predicted in this book. Like, it's really uncomfortably accurate. She's really tuned into the ways in which the capitalist system, a techno-fascist takeover of government, the absolute exploitation of the environment, and the repression of any kind of environmentalist groups all combined to create this absolute hellscape that we will apparently shortly be living in. I also wanted to talk briefly about some of the most entertaining books I read in 2025, and the first one was Yellowface by R.F. Kuang. This novel follows the struggles of a white woman as she competes with another graduate from her writing program who's Asian American, who ends up being much more successful than her, and she's deeply jealous. She ends up engaging in all kinds of sketchy activities and appropriating another person's identity in her quest for literary fame. And then there was another one that had similar themes, which was Dissociation by Elaine Shea Chow. This one follows an Asian American graduate student as she struggles to complete her dissertation, forms friendships and rivalries with other Asian American women, ends up uncovering a vast conspiracy, and does some deep soul searching on her identity. This was a really thought-provoking one that I highly recommend. Next was Here One Moment by Leanne Moriarty. I love Moriarty's books because she always has these crazy conceits for the book that you're like, oh, that sounds kind of silly. I don't know if I would enjoy this, but then she's so good at executing it that you become very invested. The concept behind this one is there's a plane flight full of passengers, and at one point, this woman gets up and starts pointing at individual people, telling them the age and the way in which they're going to die. This understandably causes chaos. People are very upset, and then she follows several characters as they cope with having this information. As always with her books, she's really great at developing these various characters, and it's sort of this kaleidoscopic narrative. I have one more fiction one, and it's The Edible Woman by Margaret Atwood. I'm working on a project of reading all of her books because I realized that I just kind of tend to reread the ones I really love, and I haven't read a lot of her earlier work. Margaret Atwood is super intimidating. She's one of my absolute literary heroes, and it was kind of crazy to see that her first book was so excellent. So I was like, man, right out of the gate, she was just so brilliant. And in this book, she wrote about women who were immediately post-graduation after college in the 60s, which was kind of fascinating to read about because I don't think I've read a lot of fiction about young women during that time. They are, of course, struggling with the ways that men view them and this strong pressure to get married and have kids. They actually deal with it in these really funny ways, though, and I was not expecting the character's roommate to be such a scene stealer. She was really funny to read about. The book talks about a lot of her various exploits. Finally, I have a nonfiction one to add to the most entertaining list. It was The Cult of We by Elliot Brown and Maureen Farrell. This chronicles the rise and fall of the infamous WeWork company. It was one of those companies that in the 2010s attracted an obscene amount of venture capital simply because the founder was super charismatic. The thing that was crazy about this one in particular is it was a co-working company. Like, it was one of these companies that rented space that you could use for offices, and they tried to brand themselves very successfully, apparently, as a tech company. It was totally in that era of when everybody thought tech everything was good, and because he was able to convince people somehow that it was a tech company, he got all this money. Company was a total train wreck the whole time. The founder was a really bizarre person who engaged in all kinds of weird and erratic behavior. The absurdity of the whole story is really quite interesting and entertaining to read if you enjoy reading about the downfall of these kind of people, although actually the founder, Adam Newman, never really suffered that much because he of course got a golden parachute when things collapsed, which I guess that's the way our society is. I've already been talking for way too long and I haven't even gotten to the best nonfiction titles yet, so I'm gonna try to be a bit more brief for each one of these. The first deeply disturbing but life-changing nonfiction nonfiction title that I read last year was Animal Liberation by Peter Singer. This is one of the foundational texts of the modern vegetarian movement. It was originally published in the 70s. It makes a strong and I thought quite convincing case that the way we currently treat animals in our whole industrialized system is completely unethical and it needs to stop. He goes into great detail about the abuses of animals that happen in the cosmetics industry, the research industry, and factory farming. Apparently, since the book has been published, some of the really terrible excesses that he describes in the cosmetics industry in particular have been reined in, which is really good, and I thought it was impressive to read a book that actually made real change in the world. There's still a long way to go, however, and the things that he writes about in this book are truly shocking. He also talks about the concept of speciesism, which I found quite interesting. It's the idea that a lot of our moral decisions as people deciding what's okay to do to animals is motivated by an idea that all humans are better than all animals and we shouldn't take any kind of animal interest into account. He argues quite strongly that we should include animals in our circle of moral consideration. The next one was Waste Wars, The Wild Afterlife of Your Trash by Alexander Clapp. I already knew a bit about this topic from my studies in sustainability, but he goes into great detail about what actually happens when you throw things out, in particular some of the waste supply chains such as e-waste, which are typically shipped to Africa. And then he also has chapters describing how plastic is shipped to Asia. While the United States is a major culprit, it's not just the United States doing this, it's basically the wealthy industrialized nations of the world that ship their waste to various poorer countries. There's been a very long-lived myth of recycling that sort of allows people to not feel guilty about throwing things out, and that allows corporations that produce all this product in the first place to pass the blame onto individual consumers and then absolve them through this lie of recycling. So Clapp did all this very detailed research into what is actually happening, and it was very distressing. Ultimate takeaway is things that you throw out don't just disappear, they go somewhere. The next one was Opus by Gareth Gore, and this book traces the rise of Opus Dei, which is a group within the Catholic Church that I didn't realize they had been so controversial within the Catholic Church itself, but they were. Their Spanish founder was essentially a cult figure, and also he was very close with fascists in Spain. The book goes into great detail about their rise, about their various trials within the Catholic Church, and how they've become quite powerful and wealthy and have expanded into many countries, and how they explicitly seek out power within those countries. This is a huge problem in the United States, where they have become very influential and have inserted an extreme conservative Catholic view into US politics. The next one was The Exceptions, Nancy Hopkins, MIT, and the Fight for Women in Science by Kate Zernike. This was a long and detailed account of how women, starting in the 1950s and 60s, very slowly gained entry into scientific establishments in the US, from going to graduate school to slowly becoming professors. This is one of the most convincing accounts I have ever read of why feminism is seriously needed in our society, and the fights that have been disturbingly recent, and how we still have a really long way to go. It follows the lives of a few women scientists who entered graduate school and got PhDs at a time when there were hardly any women in science, and how they struggled to rise through their fields, often facing very subtle forms of discrimination, even when they believed that they weren't facing it, which was really interesting. So the woman Nancy Hopkins, who's profiled most in detail, actually never considered herself a feminist until decades into her career. Eventually, in the 90s, several of the women professors at MIT got together and realized that they were systemically excluded from having office space, having sufficient lab space, from promotions, from essential committees that made important decisions. And they got together and, to MIT's credit, convinced the school to undertake a big initiative to change this. It was really disturbing for me when the story started to overlap with the years of my own life. For me, it explained a lot about how when I was growing up, there was this big focus on having girls in science, and it was because immediately prior to that, there had been this really widespread discrimination. This is obviously still a problem that we're seeing. Women in the United States have definitely caught up in terms of education, but not in terms of holding power. We are very much underrepresented in Congress, underrepresented among the wealthiest people that make most of the decisions in our society today. And that really does show in the way that our laws are made. Another amazing nonfiction title that I read in 2025 was Killers of the Flower Moon by David Grann. This follows the story of the Osage tribe who ended up up accumulating wealth quite unexpectedly because the land that they were on turned out to hold these vast oil reserves. For a short period of time, people in this specific tribe became one of the wealthiest groups per capita in the whole world. But then a lot of them started to die mysteriously, and it took people a long time to figure out what was happening. This is a nonfiction book that reads like a thriller. It is so well researched, and it was truly shocking. So that was a lot because I've read a lot of amazing books last year, and I'm really looking forward to another great reading year. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.